Hello and welcome to episode 406 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum back at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this very dreary day, at least down here, Bill?
Well, it's kind of dreary in Florida too, Seth. I'm looking out the window here, and yeah, it's just cloudy and overcast. And I think we were supposed to have a launch today. I could see the launches out my window, but I don't think they'll launch. Clouds are too low.
Yeah, it is gross. We've had a lot of weather down here the last couple of days, and even a little bit of a tropical weather, which is the first for the season, and I'm sure it won't be the last of the season. Before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channels. It helps others find our show. If you have done so, thank you. If you haven't, please do so. Two quick PSAs. I keep seeing a lot of comments on there on the YouTube channel specifically, is you guys need to do an episode about this. You guys need to do an episode about that, or whatever the case may be. And it's always inevitably something that we've already done. So I'm just going to make the very, very gentle but strong suggestion that go back and look through our old videos, because I guarantee you, if it's Pacific War and it's related to the United States Army, Navy, or Marine Corps, or Army Air Forces, we've probably done it. And for whatever reason, y'all just can't find it. I don't really understand why. If you go to the YouTube channel, everything is broken up. Season 1, 2, 3, and now obviously season 4 into playlists. If you click on those playlists, it'll show you all the episodes in order of release on each season. Or you can just go to the YouTube channel and click the button that says video, and it will literally, or videos, and it will show you every single thing we've ever produced. So before you say do an episode on this, go back and look and see if we haven't already done an episode on that, because I guarantee you we probably have.
Yeah, if we haven't, we probably planning it. So two things that come to mind, Seth, are either the CBs and logistics. And we haven't done those two, but we planned to do something along those lines this season.
Absolutely. And there's still a lot of stuff that we want to do that we haven't done, admittedly, in like 42 or 43 or even 44, which is hard to believe. But, there are still things we want to do, but I guarantee you 9 chances out of 10, we've already done what you're asking us to do. So just go back and take a peek. You'll probably won't be surprised. But anyway, all right. Well, Bill, on with today's show. So on December 14th, 1944, the 150 or so American prisoners of war that were being held by the Japanese near Puerto Princesa in the province of Palawan were returning from their daily working party, constructing and maintaining the airfield they had built for the Japanese in the same area. Around 1400 on the 14th, an air raid siren shrieked. The Japanese guards began to yell and holler at the prisoners, herding them into the underground bunker-like air raid shelters near the prison camp. As the Americans were poked and prodded to the concrete shelters, they could not help but notice the extra guards, all heavily armed, bayonets fixed, standing outside the bunkers. One American POW, a sailor from Alabama named Charles Smith, took his sweet time getting into the bunker. At this, Japanese Lieutenant Sato Masashiko strode toward Smith, drew his sword, raised it above his head, and brought it down on top of Smith, instantly killing him. In a flash, the Japanese troops ran towards the bunkers and dumped gasoline at the entrances and lit them on fire. Some Americans in one of the other bunkers heard a muffled whoosh as the gasoline ignited, then heard the unmistakable screams of men suffering an agonizing death. Those inside the first bunker ran, many of them afire, like human torches. As they ran from the bunkers, the Japanese opened fire on them with automatic weapons and rifles. One prisoner ran out of the bunker and ran towards a guard, pleading for his life. The guard shot him, doused him in gasoline, and lit him on fire. The murder continued as the other bunker was set afire. The soon-to-be victims in the third bunker literally clawed their way out of the other end and jumped off the nearby cliff to escape. Realizing some had escaped, the Japanese attempted to hunt down and kill those who had managed to flee. Of the 150 American prisoners of war from Bataan and Corregidor, only 11 survived what became known as the Palawan Massacre. News of the massacre reached General Douglas MacArthur not long before landing on Luzon in January 1945. While not shocked, he was disgusted at the news of the murders and vowed to not let that happen again. Aware that Americans were being held in camps around Luzon, Mac hatched a plan to save those languishing in what many of the POWs called death camps. In one of the most harrowing and well-executed missions in the entire Pacific campaign, United States Army Rangers would come to the rescue of the veterans of Bataan and Corregidor in an action that would become known as the Cabanatuan Raid. Bill, this saga literally sounds like a movie. Yes, it has been made into a movie called The Great Raid, but it's unbelievable. If it wasn't true, you would think it was fiction.
Yeah, except this is one of those incredible stories of the Pacific War that just boggles the mind, the heroism. It is like a movie. Famous movie, The Great Escape, and the German the Stalags. This is not an escape per se. It's a rescue, and it's an incredible story. One of these things that causes us to just shake our heads. And if I could take you just through a couple of quick maps, Seth, this is the first one you spoke about here. This is the Puerto Princesa. It's on the island of Palawan. So prisoners were brought from Luzon. They were captured, in various places, mostly through the Bataan Death March. This is, of course, Bataan up here. And then Manila here, down to Puerto Princesa to work. And that's where that massacre in December of 44 that you just spoke about happened. The second map I want to bring you to is this Cabanatuan camp. Now that is on Luzon itself, and it's right here. You'll see Manila down here. Remember, we landed up here at Lingayen, and then the army is marching down towards Manila this way. You'll also remember that Eichelberger's troops landed down south of Manila, and they were heading up north. So you're going to say, oh, that's an easy hop, skip, and a jump for these troops to get from here to Cabanatuan to rescue folks here, but it wasn't. Maps can be deceiving, Seth.
Indeed, indeed. And we're going to go over the logistics and the planning and the execution of this mission literally to the T. And the amount of effort that was put into this is, like you said, it's mind-boggling, Bill. It really, truly is. So the Palawan massacre that we just talked about was indeed the impetus behind the Cabanatuan raid that followed it. As I said, disgusted at the news, MacArthur vowed to not let something like that happen again if he could help it. The day after landing on Luzon, Mac turned to CBS reporter Bill Dunn, and we've talked about Bill Dunn before. He was tied to the hip with MacArthur in the opening stages of the Luzon campaign, and then he does break off and go do his own thing. He turned to Bill Dunn and told him, quote, "We must move fast. As soon as we have a foothold on these shores, my aim is to push south before they know what's hitting them. I want to save as many of those prisoners as we can," unquote. So MacArthur made it abundantly clear, literally before he ever set foot on Luzon shores, that his goal was to get these people the heck out of there as fast as possible, because these are literally his old troops. These are his guys, Bill.
Yeah, they are. After I planned an operation, the first thing I did was pass it on to a reporter, Seth. So I can understand why the first thing Mac did was talk to Bill Dunn, right? That's just MacArthur. But yeah, he was also keenly aware, painfully so to be honest, that the Americans being held in Cabanatuan POW camp were survivors from MacArthur's own 1942 debacle at Bataan. And he felt guilt about this. There's no doubt about it. And later Corregidor, of course. The only question eluding Mac at that time was whether or not the POWs were still actually there. It was known, thanks to Filipino guerrillas, that in the months previous, thousands of American and Filipino POWs had been removed from the archipelago and sent to Japan, their fates as yet unknown. And on January 26th, General Walter Kruger, who was leading that 6th Army from the north, from Lingayen down, he was the commanding general. He was given concrete intel that the American POWs were indeed ahead of Kruger's advance, and they were in Cabanatuan. Kruger's intel officer, Lieutenant Colonel Horton White, had received news of the prisoners of war's existence by an American who had escaped capture in 1942. His name was Davenport. He was an Iowa native. Davenport, Iowa native. His name was Robert Latham, and you're going to correct me on the pronouncing of his name, Seth. But he reported to White day before, stating that near Cabanatuan, some 500 American POWs were being held by the Japanese. And Seth, how did he know this?
So there's something, Bill, we've kind of touched on it here and there as we've talked about these Philippine, like Leyte and the several episodes so far we've done in Luzon. It's the Filipino guerrillas. This instance that we're going to talk about here, the raid on Cabanatuan, is, in my opinion, my personal and professional opinion, their shining moment. What these guerrillas do and the lengths they go to make sure that this is a success is nothing short of unreal, truly, honest to God. So, like you were saying, Bill, Lapham had himself received news that the prisoners of war from some of the that they were there from some of the guerrillas under his command. He was not a fool. He saw the importance of this news, and he rode his horse. Lapham had a horse. He rode his horse some 40 miles through the Luzon wilderness and made his way to Horton White, Lieutenant Colonel Horton White, to give his report. Now, Bill, we're going to have a whole separate episode here in the very near future about prisoners of the Japanese, and we're going to get into the nasty, dirty, gritty, horrible, terrifying details of those poor, unfortunate souls. And we're not going to get that here, but we rest assured, guys, we're going to get into that. And there's some very famous people that are held in those camps. But back to the original story. Lapham, I honest to God don't know how to pronounce his name, stated that the prisoners of war were still in the camp, as a matter of fact, and they were in desperate condition. Most of them were sick and starved, and men were dying daily due to either exposure, disease, or outright murder. At one time, he said Cabanatuan had been the largest, most populated POW camp on the island, and confirming earlier reports, stated that the majority of the prisoners had been removed and sent to Japan weeks earlier. All that was left at Cabanatuan were the remainders, those too sick to injure or those too sick or injured to travel. So the Japanese thought anyway. All of these men were expected to die and would be useless for the slave labor, and that is precisely what it was. The Japanese had planned for those in better health, so they were left at the camp to essentially die. Lapham's guerrillas had been keeping an eye on Cabanatuan for some time. The camp was located within his AOR, and as such, his men knew everything, and I do mean everything, there was to know about the camp. His guerrillas knew the camp's layout, the guards' schedules, what guards were in the camp, what guards weren't, the work schedules for the POWs, and even the black market that was inside the camp itself, Bill. So these guys are all over this like a dirty shirt, as the saying goes. And their intel that they're going to provide is the Kickstarter, if you will, to actually making this operation unfold.
Yeah, now this mission that Latham's is undertaking here in modern parlance would be called irregular warfare. And it is a real mission. In today's forces, this is a mission of special forces or Green Berets, you probably know them as. So what Lapham is doing, he's liaison in essence with the insurgents or guerrillas, the local forces who are fighting the interior or irregular war against the Japanese. And there are two varieties of those guys here that Lapham's interfacing with. One is guerrillas, and the guerrillas in Asia were just like the guerrillas in, or the, commonly referred to as the partisans in France and places like that. So you could think of them in an equivalent fashion. But there's a second group, Seth, called scouts. And what's the difference between the Filipino guerrillas and the Filipino scouts?
Well, Filipino scouts this was the actual military unit that was in the Philippines, and that was the vast majority of the forces that were under MacArthur's command in 41, 42. Philippine scouts were, I don't want to call their regular army, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, they were. And even then, the Filipino scouts were even the more elite of the Filipino fighters that were in the 1941-42 unfortunate failed defense of the Philippines by MacArthur in that early war time period. The Filipino scouts were head and shoulders above the vast majority of the rest of the Filipino fighters in there, and that's something also to be made a mark of. When and if we do an episode just strictly on the Bataan Death March, and we probably will in the near future. Well, in the future, the vast majority of those prisoners of war were actually Filipinos. They were not Americans, just so everybody understands. There were a lot of Americans for sure, but the overwhelming majority of the prisoners on the Bataan Death March were indeed Filipinos. So
yeah, there were about 8%. So these scouts, had some structure, organization, and training. The guerrillas were essentially a pickup game.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. The guerrillas, a lot of the guerrillas, and we'll get to this in just a few minutes, but a lot of the guerrillas that you see at this stage of the war in the Philippines, especially Luzon, were people that were actually veterans of the fighting in 41, 42 that, no lie, had been released by the Japanese from their prisoners of war camp. So these guys, not all of them by any means, but a lot of them, especially a lot of the top or higher echelon leaders, were actual combat veterans from 41, 42 who had, for very obvious reason, significant skin in this game. And they wanted to make sure that the Japanese got the heck out of the Philippines. And they also wanted to inflict as much punishment on the Japanese as they possibly could. And they certainly do that here in the very near future. So that being said, as American forces were working their way up the archipelago, the guerrillas and Lapham became increasingly concerned about the fate of those who remained behind the wire. Lapham was convinced that the Japanese were going to execute the prisoners of war. He too was aware of the Palawan massacre. News like that travels very, very fast, Bill, and had seen with his own eyes the Japanese executing Filipinos left and right in the path of the advancing American forces. And you're going to wonder, people are going to wonder, well, how the heck did Lapham know about the Palawan massacre that had occurred, 2-3 weeks before this? Again, as I said, news travels fast, and there are Filipinos on Palawan. There are Filipino guerrillas on Palawan who either saw this with their own eyes or at the very least heard about it from some of the 11 Americans that escaped the massacre. And what are they going to do? They're going to get that news back across those islands as fast as they can to alert these people, because the Filipinos, people can say what they want, but in 44 and 45, as we're talking about 1945, they saw the Americans as their liberators, and they were, because they could not kick the Japanese out on their own. So Lapham and his top guerrilla advisors had even hatched their own plan, which is interesting, to break into the camp and free these prisoners of war months before MacArthur had landed on Leyte. So this is August, September 1944. The problems were many, not the least of which was what to do with these guys if and when they got them out of the camp, because these guys are sick. They got dysentery, beriberi, malaria, you name it, they got it. They're sick as dogs. They're significantly malnourished. They're starving. Some of them have been wounded by mistreatment and torture. These guys are really, really, really bad off. So if they got them out of there, what the heck are they going to do with them? Those guys probably would not survive living in the jungle without proper medical treatment for more than a week or two. And that's a very real estimate. He simply Lapham did not have the men or material with which to rescue and keep these guys alive, as he was consistently watching these POWs deteriorate literally daily, Bill. So sitting in Horton White's tent, Lapham pleaded with the lieutenant colonel, telling him that with the power and might of MacArthur's forces now on Luzon, a rescue could be executed given the right circumstances. Lapham then stated the game changer, saying that his guerrillas could and would lend assistance to any rescue effort that Sixth Army would launch, Bill.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pronounce his name Lapham. That way one of us is guaranteed to
One
get
of us
it
is right.
Yeah, so White was on board with Lapham's suggestion. He knew of the Palawan massacre. Everybody knew about it by now. And he was well aware of the Japanese contempt for Allied prisoners of war and their mistreatment of them. So he too was concerned that the Japanese would execute those remaining inside the camp should they feel the need. And for good reason, he was concerned. He was aware of the August 1st, 1944 directive issued by Imperial Japanese headquarters in Tokyo that weighed in on the quote unquote final disposition of prisoners of war. It sounds like the final solution in what became called the kill all order. Kill all order. The Japanese officially stated, quote, when the battle situation becomes urgent, the prisoners of war will be concentrated and confined in their location and kept under heavy guard until preparations for the final disposition will be made, whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, and whether it is accomplished by means of mass bombing, poisonous gas, poisons, drowning, or decapitation. dispose of them as the situation dictates. It is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate them all, and not to leave any traces, unquote. So the Americans knew about this. The Filipinos knew about this order. They knew it was a matter of time, and the clock was ticking, Seth.
Yeah. And I mean, if you needed any proof, the Palawan massacre was indeed that proof. And to be clear, the Japanese had been murdering Allied prisoners of war for years. So it wasn't anything that they didn't just flip a switch and start doing this. This was a constant thing, honest to God. It really was. So with the presence of American prisoners of war confirmed by Lapham, Horton White approached General Kruger with the news and suggested that the rescue effort be launched as soon as possible. Kruger was on board immediately. He needed no convincing that the American prisoners needed to be saved. The only thing he wondered was with what force and when. Looking at a map on January the 26th, Kruger realized that the rescue mission would be a risky one, to say the least. Cabanatuan lay well behind Japanese lines, and a rough estimate told Kruger that his forces would reach that area in maybe 5 days. Hearing the phrase 5 days, Lieutenant Colonel White broke in and told Kruger, quote, "I would say that after the 29th, which was 3 days, our odds of finding prisoners alive are quite remote," unquote. Kruger factored all the elements into the problem and agreed with White immediately. A mission had to be launched, and it had to be launched right now. The men that would carry out this special mission would have to be specially trained in stealth and rapid assault. Not having that kind of time to do any specialized training for any units currently in the field, that cut the choices down significantly. A regular line infantry unit could not carry this mission out in the amount of time that needed to be carried. Not to say that they couldn't get in there, because they could, but this called for special troops. The men who would carry out the mission would have to be in exceptional physical shape, as they would have to travel some 30 miles on foot both ways, around the clock with no respite. The men would have to be versatile, self-reliant, experts with all types of small arms, and full of fight. Only one option lay at Kruger's feet, and it was Lapham who made the suggestion, saying, quote, "Well, there's Mucci," unquote. Bill, who is he talking about?
Well, he's talking about an Italian-American named Henry Mucci, born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a 1936 graduate of West Point. Mucci, and in Italy, by the way, pronounced Mucci, had served as an enlisted man for 4 years prior to his appointment to the school on the Hudson. Mucci was in Pearl Harbor as provost marshal during the attack on December 7th, had witnessed the destruction firsthand and vowed revenge. A thin man with a pencil mustache and enormous forearms, Popeye-like, the fitness fanatic craved action. He was ambitious, always volunteering for anything that came his way, consistently asking for command of a line unit. After being in New Guinea for some time, he got his wish. In February 1944, Mucci was given command of the men from the former 98th Field Artillery Battalion. You've heard, if you have lemons, make lemonade. Well, this is one of those stories. This Field Artillery Battalion had previously been a mule-drawn unit. The Army soldiers referred to them as mule skinners, of course, as you know, and they were still using mules. Shipped to New Guinea in 1943, the mule skinners were declared obsolete. No wonder, right? Stripped of their mules, the 98th was now a unit without a purpose. So enter Henry Ham Mucci. The now unitless men formerly of the 98th Mule Skinners were suddenly transformed with a few strokes of a pen to the 6th Ranger Battalion. So going from an artillery battalion to a Ranger Battalion is a huge leap, because Rangers aren't artillerymen. They're normally the best of the infantry, and put under the command of Mucci in this case. The ambitious Mucci immediately began to train the mule skinners in the art of British commando warfare. And Seth, why British commando warfare?
Well, the Brits, if we ever did the ETO, which we're not, by the way, that's another question we get all the time. Are you going to do the ETO? No, we're not. But if we were to do so, you could do about 10 episodes on the British Commandos and how incredibly awesome those guys were. They were some of the, not the first, but some of the first special operations forces that were deployed, employed, however you want to say it, during World War II. These guys were masters at stealth, secrecy, and just killing, frankly, and special types of missions. And a lot of the Rangers that were in Europe, and not all of them, but a lot of the Ranger units that went to Europe in 1943 and 44 were trained initially, once they got over there, by British commandos. I mean, there's pictures of this stuff. There's pictures and footage of British commandos training American Rangers on how to be a straight up hardcore killer. This is no different, with the exception of the fact that there aren't any Brits over there to do the training. It's Mucci himself. And think about that for a second. Just like you said, Bill, the Rangers were then and still are now among the baddest of the bad in the United States Army. I mean, they are some of the most highly trained, highly skilled, just incredible warriors then and now. And these guys, the 6th Ranger Battalion, again, if it wasn't true, you'd swear to God we were making it up, were a former mule-drawn artillery battalion. None of these guys volunteered to be Rangers. None of them said, you know what, I want to go be an Army Ranger. They were artillery guys who had mules, and they were formed with, as you said, with the stroke of a pen into the 6th Ranger Battalion, the only Ranger Battalion in the Pacific Theater of Operations, by the way. It's rather amazing, really, if you really think about it. So
it's borderline humor, Seth.
Yeah. yeah, kind of really is. So Mucci himself personally taught all the aspects of fighting: hand-to-hand combat, knifing, bayoneting, marksmanship, the whole shebang. He led these guys on torturous marches across the tropical jungles, through treacherous rivers, up mountainsides in ferocious heat. And again, this is in New Guinea. Jungle combat, night combat, amphibious combat. Mucci taught and reveled in it all. For 1 year, he worked his men into the tradition of the United States Army Rangers that came before them, which admittedly were only a couple of years before them at best. And John Richardson, who was a veteran of the 6th Ranger Battalion, recalled, quote, "I thought he was going to kill us all. He called us rats. He called us everything but a child of God. And he told us, quote, I'm going to make you so dang mean you will kill your own grandmother," unquote. I wondered why he was putting us through so much, but before it was over, there was no question about it. I knew why. And once he got us trained and picked out, he loved us to death. And there wasn't anything too good for us. He knew what he was doing when he was training us. Again, Bill, we've said this a gazillion times. Good leaders, period, but especially good combat leaders are adored by their men. Henry Mucci was no different. They absolutely worshiped this guy. They thought he walked on water, believing that he had his troops on the razor's edge. He was desperate to show what his men could do. During the Lady landings, Mucci's 6 Rangers were given the task of occupying the outer islands. We talked about this very briefly, that guarded the approaches to Lady, a risky and very special task. However, expecting fierce action, they received very little. And when they landed, they accomplished their mission in rapid time because there were hardly any Japanese there to deal with these guys. With the rescue mission now blessed by Kruger, Mucci and his Rangers would have their time to shine. Send for him, as all Kruger said, and in an hour, Mucci stood in Kruger's tent listening to the general lay out the situation. And it's quite the situation, isn't it, Bill?
It is, yeah, indeed. So this is one of those, executions of the dictum: train harder than you plan to fight. It's true on the football field, and it's doubly true in combat. So Colonel Mucci spent the following day with Horton White and Latham, listening to them give the layout of the camp, the surrounding area, and the rough outline for the mission. The mission would be a small one in terms of manpower. A large American force simply would not be able to make it to their way through Japanese lines in an efficient, timely manner. It would take them too long. They would require too much logistics. They would be too loud, too easy to detect. So the unit that Mucci chose would have to be just a company, not the entire battalion, but a company at best. Speed and stealth would be their best allies. For Mucci, there was no real decision as to which of the companies he would send. He immediately had one in mind, Charlie Company. They probably didn't call it that. They probably called it some other word that started with a C, under the command of a Stanford graduate, believe it or not, named Robert Prince. The Seattle native was the core opposite of his commanding officer. While Mucci was loud, gregarious, outspoken, Prince was quiet and reserved. And while he wasn't as loud as a CO, he had the presence of a commanding figure with nerves of steel. The young Army captain was known as a forward-thinking, optimistic officer who was a keen judge of people and had high principles. So unlike Mucci, Prince was not a career soldier. Of course not. He went to Stanford, not West Point. He had enlisted, he joined up as an officer because he felt it was the right thing to do. He had no military ambition other than to do the job, win the war, and do it well. Described by his men as cool as a cucumber, the soft-spoken, methodical, analytical officer was the perfect man to lead the raid into the prisoner of war camp. Nothing rattled him, one of his men said. It didn't matter what was going on. All hell could be breaking loose, and with guys losing it all around him, and he always kept his head and never showed any signs of excitement, just as cool as they came, Seth. And that cool demeanor would be needed on this mission, wouldn't it?
Indeed, it would. I got the opportunity to know Robert Prince for a while, not long before he passed away, and he was literally the epitome of cool. And I'm not talking about, the Fonz cool. I'm talking about just laid back guy who knew his business, who was just the ultimate gentleman and just an incredible, incredible human being. We've spoken about him before, but never really in any detail. And this is his one really moment to shine. And he was just an absolutely incredible, incredible human being. So Mucci arrived back to his Rangers that afternoon and immediately spoke with Bob Prince, gathering C Company and a platoon from F Company. Mucci simply said, quote, "This mission is going to be extremely dangerous. Some of you might not get back. We'll go over details later, but get ready now," unquote. Pausing, and this is pretty cool, pausing, he turned around and told the assembled men the basics, saying to them that the detail would come soon enough. They were going to head east on trucks to the very edge of American lines. From there, it would be a hike of 30 miles one way and 30 back through Japanese territory both ways. The midpoint, 30 out, 30 in, was a POW camp, he told his Rangers. In that camp were survivors of the Bataan Death March. Quote, "Your job," he told C Company, "is to liberate these men. You're going to bring out every last man, even if you have to carry them on your backs," unquote. Remember those words. Mucci stressed that the area around the camp was infested with Japanese, and there was. He considered the mission so dangerous that he told C Company men that if anyone wanted out, they would not be looked down upon. He suggested that any married man step out now. Quote, "I only want men who feel lucky. If you want out, do it now," unquote. Nobody did, Bill. They all stayed.
Yeah. And having made his speech, he whirled around one more time and said to the 120 men of Charlie Company, "There won't be any atheists on this trip either." That's a pretty remarkable saying, Seth. He said, "I want you to meet with the chaplain after we're done here, and you're going to get on your knees and pray. I want you to swear on an oath before God that you'll die fighting rather than let any harm come to those prisoners." And with that, Mucci walked out. His Rangers were not the only force that would be involved in the rescue mission. He would need intel as he neared the camp, and that intel would be provided by 2 squads of the elite, and we mentioned them earlier, Alamo Scouts. 14 scouts, to be exact, would make up the 2 teams that would leave the Rangers camp 24 hours ahead of the main force of 90 Rangers from Charlie Company and 30 from F Company. So it was kind of a company plus, Seth.
Right. Reinforced.
The scouts would, reinforced company. The scouts would be led by Lieutenant William Nellis and Thomas Runzaville, and they would be accompanied and guided by Latham's guerrillas, roughly 60 in number. The guerrillas, once near the camp, would fan out and block any attempt the Japanese would make to chase after Prince's rescue force. So they essentially composed a covering force. Studying aerial recon photos and listening to the intel gathered by the guerrillas, the Rangers and scouts prepared for the mission. They knew the layout of the camp. They had a rough estimate of how many Japanese were in the camp and where the Japanese reinforcements would be located. Despite the fact that the intel was incredible, really good, there was still an air of concern regarding the raid. If the Japanese caught on or discovered the force inbound behind their lines, all would be lost, and the Rangers, heavily outnumbered, would likely be slaughtered, Seth.
Yeah, and we've briefly talked about the Alamo Scouts in past episodes, but we've never really gone into any kind of detailed operation that they perform. And these guys were, again, like you said earlier, Bill, this is a special ops mission. And these are the best of the best. The Alamo Scouts are the elite of the elite when it comes to this type of thing, and the Rangers aren't far off. So, I mean, these are literally the best hand-picked troops that the United States Army can put into this operation right here. So on April 8th, 1942, American General Edward King surrendered his forces on the Bataan Peninsula. At the time, the Americans and Filipinos considered the surrender a blessing, believe it or not. Half-starved, many wounded, and their ranks were filled with sick and diseased men. The veterans of Bataan hoped that now, in the hands of the Japanese, they would be fed and given proper medical treatment. Fearing annihilation at the hands of the military operation, King figured that treatment at the hands of the Japanese would be better than the disease-infested jungles of Luzon and the complete lack of food his men were suffering with. He was wrong. The Japanese herded the American prisoners of war into several areas, but the main two were at Mariveles and Bagak. The Japanese were initially overwhelmed with the massive amount of prisoners they had just recently acquired. Over 60,000 military prisoners and an additional 38,000 non-military prisoners quickly turned into a logistical nightmare for the Japanese. On the military side, the majority of the Filipinos and Americans were nearly starving. Their rations had been virtually non-existent for months, and disease touched almost every man in some way. The men were hungry, sick, and many of them were wounded. And Bill, again, before somebody says, do an episode on the fall of the Philippines, we have. Go back to that and listen to it. And we're not here to bash on MacArthur, but the reason that these guys were starving is because Max screwed up that logistical plan when he decided to basically just haul off and hold the Bataan Peninsula and leave all the chow, which is exactly what he did in 1942. So once consolidated, the prisoners of war that the Japanese, once they had consolidated the prisoners of war, the Japanese began to strip these men of everything they had, forcing the men into rice paddies and open fields. They went through their pockets of the men one by one. Woe betide the man that had anything Japanese on him, be it Japanese money, souvenirs, whatever. Those guys were immediately executed by the Japanese because they figured that they had taken them off of dead Japanese soldiers, and in most cases they had. But the random executions in these fields, Bill, that was just a harbinger of things to come, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, because they hadn't seen anything yet. The Japanese General Hama he needed to get the prisoners out of the Mariveles area so that he could continue his assault south towards Corregidor and crush the last of the remaining Allied defenses. Obviously, we're still in 1942 right now. In order to do that, he ordered that the prisoners, sick or not, be force-marched out of the area immediately to a point further north. So beginning on April 10th, 1942, the Japanese forced the men to march north toward the San Fernando railhead. Now I'm going to go back to my map here. And so the Bataan Peninsula is here, and they're going to march them up, and I think it's about 100 miles to San Fernando there. So that was in April. The POWs were corralled in groups of 100 or so men at a time, with 4 guards assigning each group of 100. Initially, the treatment, especially from Japanese officers, was charitable, with Japanese even sharing a little bit of food with their captives. However, the enlisted Japanese who had to guard these troops shared no such compassion for the Allies under their watch. Brutality became the word of the day, as men were beaten, denied water and food, and when they fell behind, or any other malcontents, summarily executed. One of the largest mass executions occurred on April 12, 1942, at the Pantegan River massacre. They're acting under the orders of Colonel Tsuji Masanobu. Japanese hog-tied 350 Filipino and American officers and enlisted men with phone wire and either shot, bayoneted, or beheaded the men along that riverbank. So along the march route, prisoners were regularly beaten, bayoneted, beheaded, forced to march in the sun with little pause and zero water. Anyone who fell out was killed. Trucks following behind the column of bedraggled prisoners of war ran over the dead and sometimes ran over the not yet dead. So with prisoners of war laying in the road, just unable to keep going, Seth.
Terrible, absolutely terrible, terrible scene. Dysentery and dengue fever spread amongst the men rapidly. And you can imagine, and most of these guys, admittedly, were sick long before the before the Bataan Death March. These guys were in terrible, terrible shape. But this just exacerbated that problem. The heat at that time of the year was unbearable, reaching an estimated 100 degrees. That's real fuel. That ain't heat index. For most of the march. Upon reaching the railhead that Bill was talking about before, the men were stuffed into stifling metal boxcars for the rest of the journey to a little place called Camp O'Donnell, a really nice little place. The deaths were incredible in these boxcars because guys were literally, crammed in there like sardines in a can. People suffocated. They were crushed literally by the weight of other prisoners. The guys could not sit down. They were standing up. So if you had to use the head, you just did it right there. It was absolutely horrendous. Once at O'Donnell, the men continued to die at rapid rates. Of the estimated 83,000-ish men who started the Bataan Death March, only 54,000 made it to Camp O'Donnell. Not all of those were deaths, admittedly. Some men escaped into the jungle along the route. These guys later became some of these guerrillas that we're going to talk about. Estimated deaths due to the march itself range widely from 16 to 20,000, most of whom, about 80%, as we were saying earlier, were Filipino. Camp O'Donnell was an absolute hellhole. Conditions were so deplorable. Think about this for a second. Conditions in Camp O'Donnell were so bad that the Japanese removed most of the Americans from Camp O'Donnell and sent them to Cabanatuan in late 1942. From then on, Cabanatuan was the main prisoner of war camp on Luzon. The Filipinos, some of them, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, were paroled. Not all of them by any means, but a great many of them were paroled under the threat of death should they become guerrillas, which of course many of them did, Bill.
They did, yeah. So back to 1945, early on the morning of January 28th, the Rangers awoke and prepared for the raid. The tension was palpable throughout the camp. Adrenaline was high as the men moved around in the dark, prepping weapons and gear for the truck ride to Gyumba, where the force would officially kick the mission off. At 0500, the men climbed onto the back of Deuce and Half, a bunch of them, that were to bring them to Gyumba. At the head of the column was Mucci, pipe between his teeth, with his 1911 tucked safely away in a shoulder holster. Mucci would lead the force, and Prince would lead the rescue. So Prince hopped onto one of the trucks, checked his gear for the 10th time, and sat down. Cool as ever, Prince wasn't nervous, or at least he didn't seem nervous. He was wondering how fate had put him here at this moment. 2 friends he had signed up with before the war were sent to the Philippines. Both of them were captured, and for all he knew, they may be in the camp he was just about to liberate. Only fate and a pencil had kept him out of the unit that allowed him not to be captured. And so, putting his thoughts aside, he settled in for the truck ride. By 07:15, the Rangers reached Gumba, the forwardmost American point on Luzon. Dismounting from the trucks, they formed into squads and cooler jets. They didn't call it that then, though. The POW camp was out there some 30 miles away behind Japanese lines, and the reality hit some of them like a train. This was no ordinary mission. They were going out behind Japanese lines. This was historical, and more importantly, they were rescuing their own. The men left behind to rot on Bataan. The realization seemed to hit the men all at once, Seth.
Yeah, and think about this. You know, we've already said this. This is 120 guys, not counting the guerrillas. This is just the Rangers. 120 guys going to rescue 500. I mean,
yeah.
The disparity in forces here is tremendous. It's huge. And that was the number one thing these guys are thinking is, what the hell are we going to do with these people if we get to that camp and get them out? There's 500 dudes. There's only 120 of us. What in God's name are we going to do with these people? How are we going to get them out of that situation or out of the location and bring them back to American lines some 30 miles when they know dang good and well they're probably going to be chased by the Japanese? It really boggles the mind when you really think about it, Bill. It's incredible.
Yeah, there's a disparity between the number of Rangers and Japanese too, right? So this is one of those classic questions of what does success look like? And man, I'm not sure I would have been able to answer that question if I had been them.
No, it's a hairy situation, and it gets hairier here in just a few minutes. So, I mean, among the many questions, like we were saying, is how are they going to get these people out of here? You know, literally, physically, how are they going to get them out of here? Are the Japanese going to ambush them on the way in, on the way out? Are they going to give chase? The only thing that they had in their favor, or so they hoped, would be the element of surprise. They knew that they would be outnumbered by the Japanese in the camp. There were some 250 Japanese that were estimated to be in the camp itself. Their number only ticked in the Rangers at 121. As I said, 90 and 30 plus Mucci, that's 121. Mucci wanted to move out closer to dusk for obvious reasons. At 1400, he felt the time was right, and he gave the order to move out. At the head of the column was Mucci, Prince bringing up the rear, and ahead of them, ahead of the Rangers, were the guerrillas acting as guides to the camp. As Mucci led his men out and got further behind the lines, American artillery would sometimes whistle overhead and explode in the distance. He was concerned, Mucci was concerned, and this is a very legitimate concern, about friendly fire. This mission was so secret that literally outside of Kruger and Horton White and the guerrillas, nobody, and MacArthur, nobody else knew that this was going on. So none of the other American forces in and around the area had any inkling that this operation was unfolding right now. If the Rangers were spotted by friendly aircraft specifically, they would more than likely be attacked, Bill. So, I mean, it's hairy just in and around your own people right now.
Yeah. Well, MacArthur knew, then Bill Dunn, or the CBS News guy, whatever his name was, he probably knew too, though. So you could add one more to that list of people who knew. So, yeah, I mean, they're going out, they're getting further behind American lines. American artillery would sometimes whistle overhead. So that's that blue on blue he's worried about. And the terrain was a frying pan. Crossing through rice paddies, the Rangers made slow, easy target as they plodded through enemy land, tripping over clumps of rice plants, mud piles, dung piles, and everything else made the going arduous and slower than Mucci would have liked. As the Rangers moved deeper into enemy territory, they ran into local guerrillas, all willing to help. This is incredible. At Lobong, the Rangers paused and Mucci conferred with the local guerrilla leader who offered his assistance. Among the guerrillas of Eduardo Jozon were kids, old men, former Filipino soldiers, and their weapons ranged from 1903s, which are pretty good weapons, from the Bataan days, to bolo knives, which can be a pretty good weapon too. Mucci took any help offered, and now the 80 guerrillas under Jozon attached themselves to the Rangers. They would operate ahead of the force to scout and offer assistance. About an hour before nightfall, the Rangers left Lobong. The flat rice paddies gave way to a forest as the men tried to make their way blindly through the forest at night. They had trained for this, remember that, that year-long training. So the potentially hazardous trip was made relatively quickly as the Rangers broke out from the woods into a caribou trail that made its way through tall grass just south of a barrio called Balok. And here's a fun personal fact, Seth. I'm a member of the military order of the caribou. You probably didn't know there was such a thing.
I did not know that. I did not know you were a member of said unit.
I am, yeah. And you can imagine it's attached to, it has something to do with the Philippines, and their annual gatherings are called a wallow. And I'll leave it at that, Seth.
Well, now I'm intrigued. So just ahead of Balok lay the national highway, clustered, and I do mean clustered, with Japanese on the move in the darkness. Mucci could see dozens of Japanese trucks loaded down with infantry moving down the road. Dangerous situation, to say the least, Bill. Mucci passed word that when the convoy came to a lull, how long is that going to take? The men would go across the road one at a time and then, quote, run like hell across the field. I'll meet you on the other side, unquote. The moon, unfortunately, was bright as the Rangers made their way to the road literally at a crawl. Some of the men had made their way across when Mucci spotted a Japanese tank not far away, parked on the road. Prince pulled out a hand-drawn map and saw a ravine. He conferred with Mucci, who then made the rest of the Rangers go under the road, through the ravine, right past the tank. None of these guys were seen. 12 miles into their journey, all so far had gone well. Mucci and Prince conferred with the guerrillas while the Rangers caught their breath. So this is literally, there was some dialogue that was, let's just say it was less than PG rated between Henry Mucci and Robert Prince when they literally saw the tank at the same time. It was like, oh, dear God, because it wasn't far. I'm not talking like a mile down the road. I'm talking like 150 yards away, a tank sitting there, right there. Mucci, who then made the rest of after catching their breath, the men moved on. Passing barrio after barrio, the Rangers pecked their way through the fields of kojon grass and rice paddies. Avoiding highways and main roads, if possible, the men paused in the barrios to talk to the locals, gather any intel they could, because they needed the hot dope all the time, and snack on rations. Everywhere they went, they were welcomed by the Filipinos. The population handed out food whenever they could to the Rangers and offered them drink. The hospitality was nice, Bill, but it was slowing these guys down.
Yeah, they were welcomed by the Filipinos, but they're also welcomed by the Filipino dogs, which every barrio seemed to have a plethora of, Seth. So every time the Rangers neared a new barrio, the dogs would go berserk and start barking their dogs. Mucci was afraid of the dogs would give them away to the Japanese. So after talking with the guerrillas, it was decided that the guerrillas would enter the barrios well ahead of the Rangers and do something about the dogs. Now, before you call the SPCA, all they did was muzzle them.
Indeed.
The trick, what was that?
I said, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. The trick worked, as throughout the rest of the night, the men were not bothered by barking dogs. However, that wasn't the main worry from Mucci. He was fully aware that every barrio he had made this way had been waiting for his arrival. How does that happen? Did MacArthur inform the press? I'm laying on that too heavy, I guess. Every local within spitting distance knew the Rangers were on their way and were headed for Cabanatuan. If they knew, then maybe the Japanese knew too. Making their way to Balinkaran at daybreak, only about an hour away from the camp, Mucci stopped his men. They had been on the march for over 24 hours. They needed a rest, as did he. He ordered his men to strip their gear, find some shade, and get some sleep. They were going to need it. Aside from rest, Mucci needed hot intel, and so did Prince. They needed the latest dope from the Alamo Scouts, who were still ahead of them, in order to see if the Japanese had reinforced or if the POWs were even still there. So that's what they're waiting for as they hatched the final iteration of their plan, Seth.
Yeah, and we keep hitting on this if the POWs were even still there. And that was a legitimate, obviously, but it was a legitimate concern. And because the Japanese, and Bill, you touched on it at the very beginning of this episode, that the Japanese had moved a lot of their people out, a lot of our people out of Cabanatuan. There were several thousand there, and they were moved out. And we'll get to this when we talk about POWs. They were put on hell ships. That's what they were. Well, at least that's what we called them. And these guys were sent to Japan as slave labor. So the question was very legitimate. Are these guys still there? I mean, it has been 24 hours or so ish, a little bit more than that, since we left. We haven't heard, and there is no radio contact right now. There's eventually radio contact later on, but at this stage of the mission, there is no radio contact. Mucci's not talking to Horton White or anybody else. Only intel he's getting are what the guerrillas are telling him, and he's fully aware that the Alamo Scouts, like we said, there's 2 squads of them, are out ahead. But he hadn't really heard anything from these guys yet, so he don't know what the heck is going on. He has literally no friggin' clue. So resting in Balinkaran, Mucci and Prince met with the 2 Alamo Scout leaders, Nellis and Runzaville, as well as a guerrilla leader named Captain Juan Peyote. This guy is bad to the bone. Peyote had 200 men at his disposal and was more than willing to assist in the rescue operation. As Mucci questioned the Alamo Scouts, he learned that the terrain around the camp, unfortunately, was flat grasslands, which would leave his men dangerously exposed as they made their way to the camp. Mucci then told the scouts and Peyote that he wanted to attack that evening. Peyote immediately resisted, stating that the several large Japanese units had moved into the area in the last 24 hours. This is the hot dope that he needed to hear, Bill. He told Mucci that roughly 1,000 Japanese were bivouacked across the Cabyu River, only 500 yards from the camp. He then said that a further 7,000 Japanese were in and around Cabanatuan itself, several miles away from the camp, but still within dangerous distance, or as we like to say, Bill, stupid close. Peyote said that he believed that the Japanese, all 7,000 of them, were about to move on within the next 12 hours. He stated that they appeared to be breaking camp and moving north away from the advancing American forces. No surprise there. Peyote recommended waiting for this unit to disappear before hitting that camp. Mucci.
Good recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's 121 guys. I don't care if you got 200 guerrillas. You are not going to make a dent in 7,000 Japanese. This mission's going to fail immediately before it ever starts. Mucci digested this information, which that had to be a hard pill to swallow, and postponed the raid for 24 hours. At this point, he does get on the horn, gets a hold of Sixth Army headquarters and says, "Hey," I forget his exact words, but it's literally something along the lines of "new developments, postponed 24 hours." He then asked, Mucci then asked for the Alamo Scouts he needed some better intel. Even though this intel that he had gotten from Peyote specifically was outstanding, he needed absolutely flawless, concrete intelligence from these Alamo Scouts. That's their job. Their job is to be covert operators and go behind the lines and get that intel. He then, with Mucci, then withdrew his Rangers a further 2.5 miles away from the camp, Bill. Now let's talk about these Alamo Scouts. Tell us about these guys, what they do here. This is incredible.
Well, for one thing, they can look like and dress like locals, and that's what they did here. They departed at 11:30 in the morning, gained access to an abandoned shack some 250 yards from the camp, where they put the camp under almost constant observation, creating extremely detailed diagrams and reports of the camp, its gates, enemy troop strength, the watch routine, location of radios and telephone wires, and advised of the best attack routes and the withdrawal routes out. So, I mean, it could not get better than this as far as the intel goes. So this is how valuable, and this is something that the Americans could not have done without them. Later that afternoon, Mucci received the scout's report and handed it to Prince. He had to be smiling when he handed it to Prince. Handing him the papers, he simply said, "Here you go. Now it's all yours." Sitting down in some high grass, Prince spread the papers and some maps out in front of him, began to sketch out a plan. He was concerned at what he saw. There was absolutely zero cover for his Rangers. Now, many of you are going to know this, but just to reinforce, there's a difference between cover and concealment. The high grass can provide concealment, but cover is what you need to stop bullets. There was no cover. So when he said get behind cover, that means get behind something that'll stop bullets. The grass won't do that. So when he says there's absolutely no cover for his Rangers, that's what he means. Not one single tree, not a big rock, nothing but grass. His men would have to crawl several hundred yards. They'll have some concealment before they got near the main gate. So crawling wasn't the issue. They're trained for this. It was the lack of cover. He knew that if one guard saw them coming and opened fire, it would be a bloodbath. As Prince pondered a plan, there's some alliteration for you, Seth. One thing stuck out. How in the heck was he going to get 500 frail and immobile men out of the camp in any kind of rapid pace, potentially under fire, with just 120 Rangers? Quite literally asking the question aloud to no one in particular, one Pehoda spoke up and said, "Carabao." Mucci, standing nearby, questioned Pehoda, "Carabao? You mean water buffalo?" Pehoda enthusiastically shook his head, yes. And he said that he would go through the barrios and round up, cowboy style, as many of the carabao and carts as possible, and they would carry the prisoners of war out of the camp. The way back out to American lines would be glacially slow. You ever see a carabao run? It ain't fast. But the beast could move, and it might work. The Rangers really didn't have much of a choice in this matter. Pehoda smiled and said, "We'll be waiting on the banks of the Pampanga River at 2000. So you better be there, Seth."
Yeah. This guy, he was incredible throughout this whole raid. And this is a bad dude. I mean, he was one of the significant, important guerrilla leaders of the entire war in Luzon specifically. But this is truly his moment to shine. The mission probably would not have come out as well as it did. And I know I just spoiled the story, but let's be real. Everybody knows what happens here. If it wasn't for Peyote, honest to God, with a small bit, and I do mean a small bit of time on his hands, Mucci instructed the Rangers to rest for the night. He told Prince to hold off on his plans until he got the hot dope from the Alamo Scouts. He needed more hot dope due in at daybreak. The report from the Alamo Scouts was received at that point and brought good news. Again, remember, they're talking about the 7,000 Japanese in one area and the 1,000 Japanese in this area. They're waiting on news that these guys are going to get out of Dodge. They need this information before Mucci's going to commit his people. The large force of Japanese had indeed, as per Peyote, moved on. The roads were clear, and the camp itself, while guarded for sure, was nowhere near as infested with Japanese as it had been only 24 hours earlier. Mucci had been right in postponing the raid for 24 hours, knowing that his men would crawl towards the camp completely exposed with only an hour of darkness before the full moon showed itself. Prince was advised by Peyote to ask for an airplane. Peyote said that the Japanese in the camp had become increasingly agitated and scared of American aircraft. He said that an airplane flying overhead would force the guards inside their barracks and would give the Rangers a bit more time to make their crawl. Sounded good to Bob Prince. He needed all the help he could get in getting his people unobserved to the camp gates. So he asked for and received, and we'll talk about this in detail in just a minute, a P-61, one of the coolest airplanes of the entire war, Black Widow, that would fly over the camp as the Rangers crawled towards it. Prince thought that the trick was thin, but it was worth a shot. He had nothing, literally nothing to lose. His plan, and we'll get this, these are the details, would split the Rangers into two groups. This is Prince's plan. 90 Rangers under Prince would launch the main attack and escort the prisoners of war out. The 30 Rangers from F Company would start the attack by opening fire on the Japanese from the rear of the camp at 1930. Prince figured the whole process of getting in and getting the prisoners of war out would take about 30 minutes, Bill.
Yeah, that's pretty
tight.
That's tight. Yeah, that's tight. He's an optimist. Once inside the gate, yeah, his people would race down the central road of the camp, turning right and riddle the Japanese side of the camp with automatic weapons fire. Anyway, that was the plan. Then bazooka teams would infiltrate deeper under that covering fire in the camp and destroy a shed where the Alamo scouts believed tanks might be parked. With the Japanese theoretically dead at this point, and the last contingent of Rangers would run into the camp and free the prisoners of war. Then all of the Rangers and Alamo scouts would walk the POWs out and to the waiting Uber-like carabao. So this is an audacious plan, Seth. It sounds good, but the old saying goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Let's see if this one does. Prince would direct the entire parade from the main gate. As the POWs left the camp, he would personally inspect every barracks to make sure no one was left behind. When they were all safely out of the camp, he would launch a red flare as a signal that the camp had been evacuated. Or aside from the Rangers' duties, Prince outlined duties for the guerrillas as well. Peyote's guerrillas would destroy the Cebu River Bridge, then form a massive roadblock for advancing Japanese who were sure to respond to the attack. We sometimes refer to troops in that kind of situation as speed bumps. Hopefully these guys were going to be more than just a speed bump. This would cut off the 1,000 Japanese still bivouacked nearby and theoretically not allow them access. Should the Japanese charge across the river, even with the bridge blown, Peyote's guerrillas would be waiting for them. Captain Joseon's 80 guerrillas would erect another roadblock south of the camp to stop any Japanese coming from Cabanatuan City. This is called defense in depth. Joseon and Peyote would be armed with bazookas should the Japanese tank make an appearance. Prince took his final draft of the plan to Mucci, who looked it over, smiled, and simply nodded. Mucci stood up, turned around to Prince and said, "We leave at 1700. And that was that. The raid was on, Seth.
So at 1700 on the dot, Bill, the Rangers moved out of Platero. As the raid would occur in darkness, at least some darkness, to aid in their recognition, the men tied white cloths around their arms to avoid friendly fire. Again, remember that too. 45 minutes after leaving Platero, the Rangers crossed the Pampanga River and split into their two groups. Shortly after, the guard towers of the camp came into view, and Prince figured that the danger of detection was growing too great and ordered his Rangers to ground. Crawling across a dried rice paddy, The Rangers came upon the shack where Nellis and his Filipino assistant Vaciar were hiding. These are the two Alamo scouts that had been given all that ridiculously detailed information. This is exactly where those cats were hiding. Having observed the camp for the last 24 hours or so, the two Alamo scouts joined the Rangers in their agonizingly slow approach. So now they've got a little more reinforcement. The scouts are also going to take part in this raid. The closer they got, the more movement inside the camp was visible. As they drew closer to the camp, a bell inside the camp. This, again, it's like a movie. The tension is racking up every single second here as they get closer and closer. A bell started pealing inside the camp, and it just kept going and going and going. Prince began to worry at this point, and Mucci, who was alongside Prince, remember, Prince is going to lead the raid into the camp. Mucci's leading the raid to the camp. Both of these guys are starting to get a little antsy. We say Prince was as cool as a cucumber. This is when he needed that cool composure right about now. Mucci thought that the guys had been spotted, and the men all around them started to take the safeties off their M1s, get ready to rock and roll. They planned to make a break for it across the paddy to the camp. Suddenly, the bell stopped ringing. And then from inside the camp, a muffled explosion was heard. Nobody, to my knowledge, all the research I did writing this, nobody knows what the heck that noise was. Nobody knew what it was. One of the Rangers, a platoon leader named Lieutenant William O'Connell, thought that noise was a mortar. He jumped up and motioned with his hands for everyone to start running. Almost as soon as he did that, someone, an enlisted man, yelled at him to get the hell down, and he did. And all was quiet again. Again, the tension on this with these guys, they're laying in the middle of an open field, theoretically under Japanese observation. And if the Japanese start shooting, a lot of Americans are going to die here. So, I mean, the tension is that, we always say the bravery level when we did Samar was at 11. The tension level here is at 11. The minutes seemed like hours as these guys are laying in the field until Prince decided that they were safe. Safe or not, that was too close of a call in his mind. Now less than 3/4 of a mile away from the camp, 3/4 of a mile. The Rangers would wait until dark and crawl the remainder of the way on their bellies, Bill.
Yeah. So that highlight the point there that to this point, it's daylight. So when the lieutenant stood up and was told to get down, he did that in daylight. It's a miracle that nobody saw him. And as Prince and his Rangers lay in the rice paddy, a dull rumble was heard from behind them. This is what they were hoping for. The rumble became more distinct as an American night fighter, the P-61 Black Widow, emblazoned with a Vargas girl, no surprise there, painted on its nose, and the name Hard to Get next to the painting. If you don't know what a Vargas girl is, don't look it up. Banking low over the camp. The plane screamed across the Pangana River and circled back for another pass. The Japanese, thinking they were under attack, scatter. As the plane circled again, the pilot faked engine trouble by killing one of his two engines and started it back up again, performing a one-man air show. The pilot, Kenneth Schreiber, did loops, rolls, and stalls over Japanese territory. But is this guy crazy? Over and over again, the 61 did its thing for 20 minutes. If nothing else, 20 minutes, yeah. If nothing else, the Japanese scratching their heads. What the heck is going on? Probably had them looking up too. As Schreiber did a show, the guerrillas under Peyote, specifically Lieutenant Carlos Tombo, cut the telephone wires to the camp. The plan is beginning to unfold. Peyote's men also planted explosives on and under the Cebu River Bridge and readied the explosives with a time bomb. Hopefully the bomb would go off at 1945 as planned. After the Rangers hit the camp. Down the road further, Joseon's guerrillas had taken their place and had to block the road. It's almost as if they had rehearsed this. This is a multinational, we would call it not a joint, but a combined operation with different units that had not trained together.
Exactly.
And this thing is falling into place. Seth, this is amazing.
It truly is. It truly is. And I'm really glad you said that, because that hadn't occurred to me until you said that. These are guys that had never worked together before at all. Never. And the guerrillas, most of them, not all of them, most of them did have military training. We said, not all of them, but a lot of these guys were veterans of the 41-42 campaign. And by the way, they've been acting as guerrillas for the last 2 years. So these guys had some, they'd seen the elephant, literally. And but the fact that these guys are operating really flawlessly to this point, having never trained before, literally having met each other less than 24 hours before, is truly, truly remarkable. F companies, yeah, I mean, it really is. It's truly remarkable. F Company's 30 Rangers, under the command of Lieutenant Murphy, had already moved into position. Theirs would be the starting shots of the raid. Spreading out around the camp, the men picked targets and prepared to open fire. Aiming at the guard tower specifically, the men were ready, albeit 10 minutes late. As the P-61 retreated, Prince's men were also in position. Everyone was ready to go. They were simply waiting for the first shot. 30 feet away. 30 feet away. The Japanese guards talked to each other, completely unaware that 90 United States Army Rangers were mere feet away with weapons at the ready. At 1940, the waiting ended. Murphy's F Company opened fire on the guard towers and the Japanese barracks with everything they had. Within 15 seconds, all of the guards in the towers were dead, and the pillboxes at the edge of the camp were destroyed. Inside the camp, the POWs thought the gunfire was the execution that they felt was sure to come. Sure that they were being executed, many of these guys, and you can understand why, began to panic. Prince's men opened fire as well, encircling the camp with small arms fire, so withering that the Japanese literally could not respond. Teddy Richardson, one of Prince's men, got up and ran towards the main gate and shot the lock off the gate, literally like something out of a cowboy and Indian movie. It's incredible. As he did so, he flung the gate open and Prince's men tore into the camp. Lead elements ran down the center of the camp, opened fire on the Japanese officer quarters as a bazooka team from F Company ran into the camp on the other side towards the building that was supposed to house the tanks. As they did, 2 Japanese trucks came out of the building and were promptly destroyed by the bazooka team. The POWs, still convinced they were being executed, for the most part, Bill, froze. Rangers began running through the camp yelling, quote, "We're Yanks, we're Yanks. This is a prison break. Head for the main gate," unquote. Most of the POWs thought it was a Japanese trick and stayed in their barracks convinced they were going to die, Bill.
Yeah, Seth, is this the part where John Rambo runs into the camp with a K-bar in his teeth and starts, this is like a movie. My goodness. And of course, the POWs were confused. What Americans call themselves Yanks? Okay. Right. They must be a trick, right? So there's some British dudes calling them, pretending that they're Americans, right? So it's just hard to believe, but things continue to fall into place. The Rangers pleaded with the men to get going. "We're here to save you," they said. Run, damn it. Still, the POWs would not move, forcing some Rangers to grab men and physically carry them out of the barracks. Good news that they only weighed 90 pounds. I don't know. Yeah. Others became indignant and argued with the strangely clad men because their uniforms and weapons, they were new to these POWs. The uniforms had completely changed since they were captured in 1942. Arguing with the Rangers eventually ended when several of the rescuers chose some very American profanity and yelled at the POWs to get moving. The profanity seemed to do the trick. The POWs started evacuating the barracks. One of the POWs, named Alvy Robbins, said, "I thought we'd been forgotten." A Ranger replied, "No, you weren't forgotten. We're here to save you. Just took us a while to get here." Another POW sporting a homemade club was stopped by a ranger and asked, "Hey, Matt, can you walk?" The POW replied, "Oh, yes, I can. I walked out of Bataan, and by God, I'll walk out of here." As the Rangers ran in and out of the POW barracks, the shooting died down. Some shooting was still going on, but in short spurts here and there. Now, with the Japanese eliminated, the job was to get out of the camp and get out of the camp now. As the strapping, healthy Rangers led the emaciated POWs out of the camp, the reality of their mistreatment hit the Rangers. There was many a tear shed at the sight of these starving POWs. Hip bones protruded, skeletal arms and legs, and the POWs were pitiful, pitiful shape. Many had to be carried out by the Rangers. As a Ranger named August Stern was leaving the camp, he came across, he didn't know, it was the camp chaplain, Hugh Kennedy, and he picked him up. Carrying the clergyman like a small child, the Ranger came upon a trench filled with raw sewage and began to use a few choice words as it pertained to that sewage. And then realizing who he's carrying, that he's carrying a chaplain, he stopped and apologized. Kennedy said, "Son, you're forgiven. There's a time and place for everything." Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And this is the time and place for that, Seth.
You know, I have to say, I don't have the cleanest mouth on the planet. I have, an affinity for using profanity in certain situations. And when I was doing the research for this and writing that, I came across that, not just that part, but the other part, that the profanity, the American profanity, choice words, as you said, is what got the guys going, the POWs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very true. Like, it's very true. There's very few nations that have that, I don't know, vernacular, we shall say.
Yeah,
and when these POWs heard that, they're like, "Oh yeah, these guys are Americans. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it." And it tickled me. It made me laugh.
And let the record show that I'm the sailor, but Seth's the one who swears. Go ahead.
Man, yeah, it's a nasty habit. It's hard to break too. As the POWs at this point finally begin hustling, God bless them, as best they can out of the camp, they came under Japanese mortar fire. Now, they had killed, the Rangers had killed most of the Japanese, but not all of them. 3 rounds of mortar fire dropped in amongst the men, wounding several of the prisoners of war and Rangers, as well as guerrillas and Alamo Scout Tom Runeseville. Battalion Surgeon Jimmy Fisher, Captain Jimmy Fisher, was hit in the stomach, a wound which unfortunately would eventually take his life. The firing inside the camp, as you had said earlier, Bill, had died down to almost nothing when in the distance an enormous firefight suddenly started. Peyota's guerrillas, remember these 200-ish guys that are out there in the middle of the Filipino jungle? This is them, were absolutely, without a doubt, fully engaged with the Japanese, who, as had been thought, immediately moved towards the POW camp when the shooting started. The bomb on the bridge went off. This is the bomb that Peyota's men had set with the time bomb. It went off. It did not destroy the bridge, but it put a big old hole in the span, making it impassable. So it was just as good. Several waves of Japanese began to charge down the road, but Peyote, having, as we said, been a combat veteran and knew what he was doing, set up a V-shaped roadblock and allowed these Japanese to enter that trap before he opened fire, absolutely slaughtering the Japanese as they tried to get down the road. 4 Japanese tanks were indeed disabled by one of the guerrillas with a bazooka, who, by the way, had received instructions on how to use that bazooka about an hour before a Ranger handed it to him. He knocked out 4 Japanese tanks, and efforts made by the Japanese to outflank Peyote were destroyed by the Filipinos. Again, remember I said this is his finest hour? This is his finest hour. Peyote, who was in the heaviest fight of his life, performed magnificently, stopping every single Japanese assault that came his way. When the Rangers killed, it was business. That's what they were there to do. But for Peyote and his men, this was personal. And I mean, that sounds cliche, but it's true. This was personal. They were personally felt that they were taking a bit back from all the mistreatment at the hands of the Japanese. As one of the guerrillas later said, it was beautiful, unquote. Back at the camp, Bob Prince kept his promise, walking from barracks to barracks, inspecting every single one of them himself. Remember, I said barracks. He was finally satisfied that no one had been left behind. With portions of the camp afire, Prince stalked the grounds looking for anyone he could find, which he found none. His mission accomplished, he grabbed the flare pistol he had and fired the single red flare, the signal that the camp was empty and he was on his way back. At approximately 2015, 30 minutes after the raid started, it was over. Unfortunately, one prisoner, a deaf man, deaf, D-E-A-F, deaf man named Edwin Rose, was actually left at the camp. He obviously, and I'm not making fun of this, it's God's on, he obviously could not hear the fight that was going on, and he was actually trapped in the latrine. Remember I said Prince went to all the barracks? He didn't go to the head. Rose was trapped in the head. He was trapped in the latrine during the entire episode. Had no idea what the heck was going on. When he finally literally forced his way out of the latrine, he was alone. So he lay down and went to sleep. The next morning, he walked out of the camp and was found by guerrillas and brought back to American lines. Aside from that one hiccup there, Bill, the mission had gone so far. They still got to get out of here. But the mission had gone, it could not have gone any better, Bill.
Yeah, it couldn't. But of course, this is the opportunity for it to go sideways. Let's see if that happens. At 2040, the POWs and Rangers reached the river where, just as he had said, the carabao carts were waiting. Thanks to Juan Peyote, Joseon's men left their roadblock not having had to fire a shot, while Peyote's men were still heavily engaged. Their departure would take some time. Mucci, at the head of the column, kept encouraging the POWs, saying, just a few more miles. Just a few more miles? Many of the POWs, sick as they were astounded at how far they could walk. Freedom had a sense of urgency and empowerment to the newly liberated Americans. The carabao, however, moved at a glacial pace, even slower than the POWs. But at least they were putting some distance between themselves and the Japanese. As the men moved back towards the American lines, they were escorted, in a way, by P-61 Black Widows that patrolled the roads the columns were traveling on. Strafing targets ahead of them, the P-61s cleared the way for the Rangers and the POWs. At 0800 the next morning, on January 31st, the POWs and Rangers arrived close enough to American lines that trucks were sent out to pick them up. So the final 11 miles of their journey was made via these trucks, and immediate medical attention was given to those who needed it, which is pretty much everybody, and including a few wounded Rangers. So how did this fare, Seth?
It honestly could not have gone any better. If you made a movie about it, it could not have gone any better. A total of 522 people were rescued from Cabanatuan. 464 of these were Americans, along with Brits, Dutch, Norwegians, Canadians, and one Filipino. Several of the rescued men unfortunately died along the way due to their terrible health and terrible condition that these guys were in, and 2 Rangers were killed. We talked about Captain Jimmy Fisher, the battalion surgeon, who was killed, and also a gentleman named Roy Sweezy, who was killed by friendly fire. Remember I said, remember the whole white cloths around your arm thing to avoid the friendly fire. Unfortunately, in the heat of the moment, as they were withdrawing from the camp, Sweezy was shot twice by one of his own men and killed. And he knew when he lay on the ground, he was dying. And he even said, I've been killed by my own men. And it's absolutely tragic situation. But aside from the obvious tragedies that we just mentioned, Bill, this mission was an absolute resounding success. It was and still is the greatest single rescue mission in American military history. I mean, 522 people pulled out by 121 Rangers. It's absolutely, and Alamo Scouts, and obviously the help of the guerrillas too. Absolutely incredible, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were some rescues during Vietnam. There's some obviously failed Desert One rescue. Most rescue attempts do end up in failure, Seth. So nothing, in my knowledge, comes close to 522 in either theater. I mean, I don't consider overrunning a camp as part of a normal conduct, of operations,
Right.
where you're just moving, the lines are moving forward, and in the process of that, you free a camp. That's not the same as going behind enemy lines, pulling 522 people out, and then bringing them back to the right side of enemy lines, right? So I think that's right. I think that this has never happened. This never happened before like this, or since like this. I can't imagine. If you had V-22s, this would have been a risky mission. But to walk them in and walk them out, incredible, Seth.
It really is. It really is. The only other mission that comes to mind, and it was not successful, if you know anything about the ETO, is what's called the Hammelburg Raid, Task Force Baum. And it was directly influenced by this operation, by the way, where General George Patton wanted to go, and I'm not making this up, go free his son-in-law from the POW camp in Hammelburg, Germany. And it was a similar operation, but it ended in a complete and utter failure. So, I mean, that you can getting in is one thing, getting out with the prisoners of war is a completely another prospect in and of itself. And this was, without a doubt, hands down, a straight up 100% success. I mean, there were a million things, Bill, that could have gone wrong, a million things. And none of them did. I mean, again, the 2 American deaths and the unfortunate. I don't remember. I tried to find concrete numbers on how many POWs died along the route. It wasn't very many. It was less than 10. But still, that's obviously unfortunate. But I mean, considering the condition that these people were in, it was almost inevitable that some of them were going to pass away.
They were going to die anyway in the camp. So,
oh yeah,
it's kind of happenstance that they died after they were liberated.
Yeah. But I mean, it's absolutely 100% true story. And as they say, truth is stranger than fiction. This is the real deal, man. It's absolutely incredible. It was the Rangers in the Pacific's shining moment. It was really, honestly, technically their only big moment of the war. But man, what a moment it was, Bill.
Yeah. We said before, I think when we did our episode on movies, that there are so many stories of things that really happened that are better than most of the movies made before, in the past 70 years. This is one of those stories. And you mentioned that a movie was made. Yes. Was it made about this specifically?
Yes. Yeah. It's called I forget when it was made. It was made in the late 90s, maybe, or early 2000s. It's called The Great Raid. And it is about the Cabanatuan Raid. And it's a really good movie. And it has your fictional love story in it and whatever the hell. But by and large, it's pretty accurate. Bob Prince, my friend, actually served as the technical advisor for the movie for obvious reasons. And he himself, I remember him saying, yeah, it was about as accurate as you could possibly make it in terms of a Hollywood movie. So if you haven't seen The Great Raid, check it out. I don't recommend too many movies that are based on historical actions and say that they're historically accurate, but that movie is one of those that fits that category. It's based on a historical action, and it's actually historically accurate. It's a good movie too. It's entertaining.
How have I not seen this? Incredible. Okay.
Yeah,
well, there you go.
It's a good flick. Check it out.
Good.
So, Bill, anything else you want to add to this absolutely incredible story?
Now, the only thing I'll add as a footnote, Seth, is this week we passed 6 million views on YouTube, and we still have about 1 million Apple podcast downloads that we've experienced. And so I want to thank the viewers and listeners again for allowing these stories to be told, because they need to be told.
They do. And yeah, I echo Bill's sentiments exactly. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening and watching. Because if you didn't, Bill and I would just be talking to ourselves, which is fine, but it's not nearly as entertaining. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to check us out on YouTube, you know the place, you know the channel, look it up, watch it, like, and subscribe. We do appreciate it very much. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Bill, bring us home.
And we'll see you again next week.